Emmy Award-winning journalist Jane Ferguson has spent the better part of the last 15 years reporting from the front lines of some of the deadliest and most dangerous conflicts in the world. In her new memoir, No Ordinary Assignment, the, again, award-winning PBS NewsHour correspondent reflects on her experiences as an international war correspondent in nations like Yemen, Afghanistan, Iran, South Sudan, and most recently Ukraine. And she is joining me right now live this morning. Jane, thank you so much for being with us.
I'm really happy to be here.
You know, I want to get to your book, but before we do, I know you've been covering the invasion of Russia. What's your take on the conflict in terms of what differentiates Ukraine, say, from other nations who wish we would step in and rescue them?
The situation in Ukraine is really, it's hard to overstate the absolute enormous impact that this war could have globally. I mean, we've already seen that in terms of grain prices, in terms of threats for the use of nuclear weapons on the battlefield. I mean, the geopolitical framing scale of this story is enormous. The potential, the invasion effectively of Eastern Europe by Russia, by a belligerent nuclear power. There's so much to play for. And I know that right now there are so many negotiations about who should be in NATO and whether they should be in now and what America should be doing. It's worth pointing out that the moment the US enters this war, you end up with a hot war between two nuclear powers, as opposed to what we have right now, which is a tragic, devastating war in which many, many Ukrainians and Russians are dying. But one where right now what is most important is containing any kind of nuclear fallout, while also basically making sure that world order is respected by dictators like Putin.
Yeah, and it could absolutely, no matter what happens, change the face of Europe forever, for our generation. You've also extensively covered the Middle East, Kabul, Afghanistan, the fall there. You've traveled throughout those nations. We've heard horror stories of how women in journalism have been treated in those parts of the world. What is one of your more harrowing stories? And being a woman, did that ever help you in those countries?
You know, I kept thinking this week about the news out of Afghanistan, yet again, another measure taken by the Taliban against women. And it's one that was sort of a little bit lost in the media because it didn't seem as significant. But the Taliban just banned beauty salons in Afghanistan, which doesn't seem like big news. But it's important to remember that those are actually one of the few sort of broadly female-owned businesses. And when I was a reporter in Afghanistan, you know, very often I was sort of seen as a bit of a sort of curiosity, a bit of a third sex, because technically I'm a woman, but I sort of look like I dress like a man to a lot of people there. I do very often a man's job in some people's eyes, but I'm female. So I was often, you know, seen as a bit of a sort of strange creature. But one of the advantages was I was able to go into these beauty salons and talk to Afghan women. So as a woman in incredibly conservative, patriarchal communities, that is one advantage. But, you know, it's worth pointing out that increasingly more women are doing this kind of work. And when I'm in the field in any conflict, I do start to see more female war reporters out there. And I was inspired by those that came before us.
You know, you're returning to Princeton this fall to teach a course on war reporting. I would be curious to know what you would teach your younger self, because as you look in the faces of some of your students, I'm sure that after 15 years of doing this, there are some things you would change, even in light of our very vastly different world of media today. So what would you tell yourself?
Certainly, the landscape has completely changed in terms of the business and the model of television news. But I probably look back and I certainly wouldn't encourage them to perhaps take quite so many risks that I might have taken early on that I talk about in the book. I would very much so encourage them not to follow the pack, you know, not to feel that pressure to follow where all the journalists are going. You know, I mean, covering uncovered parts of the world is so important. It's a huge service and it's incredibly rewarding. So I would encourage them to do that. And I would also encourage them to really lean into the sort of collegiate community that war reporters are. You know, we're all so supportive of one another. We're all very close. We're good friends. You know, I lived in Beirut for years where there was a huge group of foreign correspondents living there. And so I would really encourage young journalists to lean into that sense of community in the industry.